So Bethlehem Church, it is great to be with you, and let me reiterate, thanks for your generosity in this season, letting us go above and beyond and blessing and serving. So many more cool things I was just having a conversation about before the service with our staff that we're getting to be a part of, and so thank you guys for that. Miss seeing you, wish you were here in person, especially, man, we hated missing Easter together last week as we celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, but what we were reminded is that the Spirit of God doesn't dwell in buildings and cathedrals, but the Spirit of God dwells in the hearts of men and women. And last weekend, I've told you guys through email this week, but I wanted us to celebrate corporately, one house, many rooms. We're going to do the biggest fist bump ever across all of our living rooms. Last weekend, 135 people texted in Christ that they chose to follow Christ last week at Easter with us. 135 people, over 26 zip codes, 5 different states. What a cool thing to celebrate last weekend at Bethlehem Church across all of our campuses, people coming to Christ. So, clap, fist bump. I don't know where you're at, if you're at your kitchen table, if you're on your couch, if you're in your garage, if you are in your pantry, if you're in your bathroom, don't fist bump there. But we're just glad you are with us. And man, we miss you so much. And we're counting down the days, the time till we get together again. For those that you have joined us in this season that have never been a part of Bethlehem Church, we want you to know we love you and you're a part of us. So we hop into today, I want to begin with a little game I like to call, we've all called it, Remember the Good Old Days. On this rainy Sunday, I just want us to remember the good old days. And what do you mean good old days? I mean 6 weeks ago. Do you remember when the term disruption or interruption was about Wi-Fi not working? Do you remember when the term disruption was about the internet being down or your phone dropping a call because you were in a bad place on the road? Or your text not going through? Do you remember when we considered that a disruption? Do you remember when the term disruption, the good old days, do you remember when the term disruption meant sitting in traffic on 316, trying to get across 316? Do you remember when the term disruption was a welcome disruption or interruption? When it rained on a spring night and you got a break from baseball or softball or soccer after many nights of practices, and oh, do you remember when that was a disruption? Do you remember when a restaurant having a line or having to wait to be seated was a hassle, was a disruption? Do you remember when you're trying to go to the movies and the theater was sold out and you couldn't get tickets at the time you wanted? Do you remember when that was a disruption? Come on. Do you remember when pollen was the most scary infectious disease that Georgia dealt with in the springtime? Come on. Those were the good old days. Do you remember when the most stressful part of your weekend was navigating the parking lot at any of our Bethlehem Church's campuses? That was the most stressful part of your weekend. Do you remember the good old days? We are all living through these last 6 weeks. We're all living through a generational altering, redefining of the term disruption. We've all been living through that. And I don't even remember ever being a time when I thought to myself, I would hear the words, man, I can't wait to go back to school. But I have heard that multiple times the last few weeks at my own house. Anybody know what I'm talking about? I can't wait to get back to the school. I mean, spring break, canceled. Sports this season, flights, cruises, amusement parks, baseball, softball, soccer, golf, tennis, track, whatever the spring sport of your choice is, canceled. Well, that's okay. At least we can still watch sports. Wait a second, no. Braves delayed. NBA playoffs not happening. The Masters is happening in November. What world are we living in? You know, it's just been a generational defining disruption as we've all social distanced, and obviously we've done that for the health risk involved with the coronavirus, but the reality is this thing continues to go. The economic ramifications for many people is what sits on their heart. And here's what you know. The coronavirus isn't the only contagious thing out there right now. Fear, anxiety, and worry are way contagious, and I would argue they have a much more high infectious rate than the coronavirus does. Fear, worry, and anxiety is the currency of our time. We're walking through strange days. And let me just say this to you. As maybe in the next few weeks or over the next month, we begin to look at what life will be like on the other side. As we begin to reorient back into gatherings, reorient back into school and work and jobs and summer and all. When we begin doing that, I don't think it's going to be easy as we think it is. Because we've been a part of what is disruption. A generational defining disruption. So what I want to do over the next 6 weeks is spend some time in the New Testament book of James. In the New Testament book of James. Because James, and he really wrestles down, and I think I want to apply it to the season that we're going through. Here's the question. If you're taking notes this morning, here's what James wrestles down. What does faithful devotion look like? Right? What does faithful devotion look like? But I want to add the caveat, what does it look like in a time of societal disruption? When people have more questions than answers. Right? When the reality is the illusion of control for many of us, for all of us, has been stripped away. With this life-altering pandemic, I want to make sure you're on the same page with me. We're not talking about 6 weeks of learning new rhythms, but I think we're really in a probably 12 to 18 month window. Not when we'll be always social distance, but when we're reorienting ourselves back into reality. And here's the truth. There's nobody that can tell you how to deal with this because nobody's ever dealt with this. We don't have collective wisdom. We can look at grandma and granddad and go, how did y'all handle it? They never handled this. Like, it's a generational defining. And the question that James brings up is in 5 short, succinct chapters. James wrestles down what belief looks like. James doesn't try to convince you to follow Jesus. James tells you what following Jesus looks like. James doesn't try to convince you of the gospel. James shows us what the gospel looks like. He shows us what belief looks like. The kid brother of Jesus is who James was. And what he writes in James about is simply this: does my belief guide what I do? James literally, and you're going to see this over the next few weeks, James literally understands belief through the reality of what you do, not what you mentally affirm. Like James would argue, you only believe the parts of the Bible that you do. It's crazy, I know. I believe the Bible. Not really, you believe what you do. You believe what you do. And there's 2 things that's interesting about James as we start. Talk about a complex. He was the little brother of Jesus, the half brother of Jesus. And talk about a complex. I mean, what's it got to be like to be James? The half brother of Jesus. I mean, it's not that his parents thought he was perfect, it's that he was perfect. And in Jesus' public ministry, Jesus' family, many of them struggled with the idea of Jesus making the claims he was the Son of God and he was the Messiah. Think about if your older brother did that. Look at John. And you don't have to turn there. We're going to be in the book of James. But look at John. Look at what it says right here in John chapter 7. This is Jesus' family. They're trying to push him out and say, hey, if you're really the Son of God, go prove it. So his brothers, James included, said to him, leave here and go to Judea that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. Even if you do these things, show yourself to the world. They're basically saying, Jesus, prove yourself, because his brothers didn't believe he was the Son of God. That was James. Mark 3 and Mark 6, you see this as well. James struggled with the idea of Jesus being the Messiah, Jesus being the Son of God. It's his brother, for Pete's sake. How can you make these claims? What changed everything for James? Well, it's real simple. Jesus rose from the dead. And he saw him. 1 Corinthians 15, we spent a little time there last week. Here's what Paul says when he's talking about who Jesus appeared to. He says he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then look at what it says. Then he appeared to James. Then to all the apostles. Not James the disciple, James and John. This is James the half-brother. And this is James who so convinced Jesus was the Son of God that he led the early church in Jerusalem, convinced people live a life of faithful devotion. And so what I want us to do, let me challenge you in your own time. Maybe your time with God, maybe your quiet time over the next few weeks. Spend some time in James, 5 chapters. You don't have to decipher what James is saying. He's straightforward. And I want you, not through Jason's lens, but I want you, as we gather together to ask yourself this question. As you read through James, what does faithful devotion look like in a time of societal disruption? What does faithful devotion look like in a time of societal disruption? As you read James in your own time with God, take a chapter a day, and what does it mean to be faithful in times like this? See, I think the principles James lays out are eternal, but the implications are different in this season of COVID-19. The principles are eternal, but the implications look different. Now, if you got your Bibles, James 1. Just start with the first few verses this morning. If you got it, James 1, and here's what it says in the ESV. It says this: James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in dispersions, greetings. So James doesn't say, hey, I'm Jesus' little brother. How cool am I? No, he says, I'm Jesus' servant, the Lord Jesus Christ's servant. So he goes from skeptic to servant. Why? Jesus rose from the dead. He saw it. It changed everything. Look at what he says. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Let me stop there. We're going to keep going in a second, but let me give you a little practical theology of a faithful devotion, and here's what James is getting at, what he wants us to know, and I want you to think about this. It's going to come up. Write it down if you get your Bethlehem Church app. Faithful devotion accepts that trials and tests are a win, not an if in life. Somebody who's faithfully devoted, what they understand is that trials and tests are a win, not an if. What does James say? When you face trials of various kinds, win, not if. Now, what is unique about this experience that we're in, this COVID-19, is we're all experiencing the same test and the same trial at the same time. Now, I want to say this to you pastorally. There's different ways people are experiencing this. Some people have been affected by the virus. Some people's job has been affected, right? Some other people not only been affected by the virus, they have loved ones that's been affected by the virus. And so there's a sense of suffering that's literal in their life. Others of us, it's the fear, it's the anxiety, it's the distancing, and it's the life halting. We've not been sick. We don't have a loved one that's been sick. It seems distant, but everything's put on hold. We're experiencing the same trial, listen to me, but we're experiencing on different levels. Now listen, here's what you got to get. James says we experience various kinds of trials. So before the pandemic, or maybe in the pandemic, there's still other things going on while life is suspended. See, family dynamics can test you and can be a trial. Work pressures in relationships can test you and be a trial. Physical sickness can test you. Financial decisions and ramifications and pressures can test you. Decision making in seasons can test you. Relocation can test you. New babies can test you. Homeschool by force and not by choice, hello, will test you. And here, let me on this. We, guys like me, and what do you mean guys like me? Guys that preach. We have a way, and I don't know if we have a way or you have a way of hearing it. I'm going to argue you have a way of hearing it, but I think what we hear in America oftentimes is guys like me says, now listen, sometimes life can be hard, so you shouldn't be surprised by that because God's not. So let me say it. We have a way of hearing this. This is the way we hear it in America. Guys like me saying, now listen, sometimes life can be hard. You shouldn't be surprised by that because God's not either. But that's not what the Bible teaches. Can I be honest with you as your pastor for a second? From Genesis to Revelation, the full counsel of Scripture says this: life is hard. God said it was going to be hard, and you shouldn't be surprised by it. You should expect it. Not like, oh, it could. No. Listen to me, church. We have to shift our perspective, right? Don't be surprised, but expect it. Peter, notice this in James, the first 3 verses of his letter to the church. Here's Peter, an apostle of Jesus. When he writes to the church, watch his first 5 or 6 verses. Look at what he says. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials. That's Peter, not James. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. James and Peter, the half-brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic, Peter, who was the most vocal disciple, both began their letters to believers saying this: life is full of trials and tests. You better be ready for it. It could happen. It might happen, but what you're owed is a blessed life. Come on, man. At some point, Scripture teaches this, and what James is trying to do is shift perspectives for us. Now listen, think about it like this. Out there, parents, for a second, go back in time with me. Grandparents, way back in time. But new moms and dads, right? New moms and dads. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you're a brand new baby, moms and dads, here's what you know. You love that baby. I mean, there's nothing more joyful. It's the miracle of life. I mean, you get baby boy, baby girl, brand new. Remember when you had your firstborn? I mean, so thrilled. But here's what you knew, because people told you this. When you bring that baby boy home, that baby boy girl home, here's what you knew. That baby was going to cry in the middle of the night. People told you that. You knew it. You bringing that beautiful baby girl home, that beautiful baby boy home, and here's what you knew. That baby was going to cry in the middle of the night. Why? Because people told you it was going to cry. You knew that. You were ready for it. You weren't surprised by it, and it was probably going to cry more than once in the middle of the night. Think about it. You knew it. But guess what? When that baby cried, when he or she cried, and when they cried more than once, even though you knew they would, that didn't make it easy when they did. Even though you weren't surprised when that baby was crying, it didn't mean in the middle of the night you were going, yes, thank you that I get to be, I just love babies crying in the middle of this is unbelievable. No, it was hard, even when you expected it. Right here, Bethlehem Church, James, the little brother of Jesus, is looking at us as he begins his whole talk and saying this: when is the question with tests and trials, not if. Don't be surprised. You better expect it. You better expect it. Here's the other thing I would say. Think about it like this. Faith is tested through trials, not produced by trials. Write that down if you get your Bethlehem Church app. In fact, look at your people you're sitting with. I think about my kids sitting with my wife right now. They're always saying, they're watching you on the couch, Dad. Say it together. Faith is tested through trials, not produced by trials. Say it one more time. Our faith is tested through trials. It is not produced by trials. Here's what James is saying. Trials reveal what faith you have, not because God doesn't know what he's trying to see, but so that those on the outside see your faith. So you know what you've got in you. Let me say it again. We go through trials and tests not because God doesn't know how much faith we have. God knows how much faith we have. But so that the world experiences it, so that we may know it. Look at what James says. Do you not know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness? And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. There's something that trials and tests build in us that ease does not. James is making the point that when testing and trials are through, you're a different person when you've endured it. And in fact, here's the word James uses: steadfast. This is not a word we use a lot, but that's the word James uses to describe what we are as people who have faith, what it looks like in the midst of trials and tests. He uses the word steadfast. Say that word with me. Steadfast. Say it one more time. Say steadfast. Let me tell you what it is. Steadfast is the ability to patiently endure. It's a sense of unwavering. That's what steadfast is. When you use the word steadfast, again, it's not a word we use a lot in our English vocabulary. But the picture is the ability to patiently endure. So let me make sure I get this. Is not, when you hear the word steadfast, it's talking about an ability to patiently endure, that you're unwavering, you're unshakable. So here's the way I would say it. Think about it like this. It's not a passive patience. A passive patience is when you're sitting at the doc's office waiting for your name to be called and you're scrolling through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, just kind of numbing your mind while you're waiting. It's just kind of a passive waiting. Nothing you can do, nothing you can control. You're just waiting for your name to be called at the doctor or at the dentist. But an active patience is more of what a steadfastness is. An active patience is like running a marathon and you're on mile 14, but you know there's 26.2 miles that make up a marathon. You know you're not at the end and the end's not coming, but you've got to continue on to get to the end. That's an active patience. You're not there yet, but you've got to do something to get there to the end. You've got to continue on. It's the only way you're going to get there. Here's the best picture I could give you. A steadfast, it's a picture of someone who's under a heavy load and they're choosing to stay there instead of trying to escape it. Somebody who's steadfast is somebody who's carrying a heavy load. Listen to me, mom and dad. Listen to me, business owner. Listen to me, parents. It's somebody who's carrying a heavy load and instead of trying to escape it, they endure. Like, I don't think any of us are against that, but this is me just for a second saying, our culture, our society is not built on this. Let me say it again. I don't think anybody's against that, but our society is not built on this. What do you mean? Well, think about it. We live in a society where you can do what you want when you want to do it. You can go where you want when you want to go there. At the touch of a fingertip, you can access anything you want. So we know getting to go where we want, doing what we want to do. We know making plans and doing them, having dreams and accomplishing them, setting goals and going for them. That's what we know. None of those are bad, but that's what our society is built on. So our society, listen to me, if you get to do what you want to do when you want to do it, go where you want to go, set goals and go for it, let me tell you what that's called in a lot of parts of the world. It's called spoiled. Steadfast is the opposite of spoiled. Like when my kids go to their grandparents, and I mean the job of grandparents is to spoil grandkids. I'm not arguing that. There's other things grandparents are good for. I'm not sure what. No, there's a bunch they're good for. But when my kids go to their grandparents, boy, oh boy, they get what they want when they want. And they are spoiled right. It's all good. Grandparents love them. But spoiled, getting what you want when you want, doing what you want to do when you want to do it, that's the opposite of steadfast. Steadfast is I'm not getting what I want, but I'm staying. Steadfast is this isn't going the way I thought it would, but I'm staying patient. See, think about it. Chuck Swindoll, he's one of my favorite authors. Here's what he says. The people I would regard as having great Christian character are invariably people who have learned how to handle life in the crucible. What's the crucible? The crushing. When it's hard, when the heat is pushed up, when there's pressure, that's the crucible. The husband who's lost his wife and says, blessed be the name of the Lord, he gives and takes away, that's a different level of faith. The person who's lost their job and they look at it as a new way to trust God. Thank God I get to trust God in a brand new way. That's a different level of faith. The student whose dreams have been put on hold, whose prom has been suspended, whose graduation isn't going to happen the way they thought it was going to happen, but still says, praise be the name of God, I trust him, that's a different level of faith. The couple that struggles with infertility but trusts God's plan and God's hand, that's a different level of faith. The person that walks through a pandemic and doesn't ever panic but stays patient and trust, it's a different level of faith. Bethlehem Church, it doesn't take a lot to say I have faith when you get what you want. It takes a whole lot to say I've got faith when you're not getting what you want and you're staying steadfast. We know spoiled in our culture. What if God's teaching us steadfast? We know spoiled as American Christians. Spoiled. Get what we want when we want. That's the way our life is. What if God's teaching us steadfast? Let me say this, just to Bethlehem Church for a second. This should be true for me, and it should be true for you. When we gather back together again, I don't know when that's going to be. Weeks, I'm hoping. Not months, I'm hoping, right? We don't know when that's going to be. But when we get back together, we should be different people than the last time we saw each other. Why? Because when steadfast, here's what James says, when steadfast does its work in you, your faith will be complete and you'll have patience, not lacking in nothing. That's what James says. Look at it right there, James 1, 2, 3, 4. What does that mean? We should be a different church on the backside of this than we were before this. In fact, if we aren't different after this, then we miss God in this. Hello. If we aren't different after this experience together, what we're walking through, then we missed God in this. And then James gives us the most practical piece of advice I could give you. Trials and tests bring a necessary season to seek wisdom from God. Look at what he says. Verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the winds. Why do trials overwhelm us? Why do we feel like caving in under pressure and test? Here's what James says. Because you lack wisdom. As clear as I can be, what James tells the early church, what I am saying to you is, if you feel ill-equipped, here's the most practical piece of advice James gives you. Ask for wisdom from God. One of the things I am learning in this season, tell me if it's not true. One of the things I'm learning is I'm not quite sure how to pray because there's so many different needs, so much different pain, so much different darkness, so many different dealing with things. There's just so much. Like, where do you begin? So what James says is this: when you're in a trial, when you're walking through a testing, here's where you begin. Ask God for wisdom. Listen, in our emotional world, here's what emotional Christians tell you they need more than anything. I need passion. I need fire. I need to feel it again. I need to know. I need endurance. I need energy. I need my mo back. Let me tell you what you need. Here's what James says. You need wisdom. James says, ask for wisdom. And God will give it liberally. What does that mean? Generously. And he says he'll give it to you without reproach. What does that mean? God doesn't discriminate against who he gives wisdom to. What do you mean? Here's what I mean. If you want wisdom, here's what James is saying. Ask for it. God doesn't say, well, that person deserves wisdom, that person doesn't. No, he wants to give it and give it generously. James is saying this: if you don't think you're a person that God will give wisdom to, look at me, you're wrong. If you don't think you're a person that God will give wisdom to, you're wrong. So let me ask you this. Parents, in this season as you pray, have you been asking for wisdom? Students, in this season as you pray, I'm not sure how to pray. Wisdom. Business owner, in this season, when you're praying, have you asked God for wisdom? More than provision, more than passion, more than energy, here's what James says. Ask God. Leader, this is the number one thing I'm learning to pray in this season. God, I need wisdom as I lead forward in this. Have you been asking for wisdom? And the truth is, we don't know how much we need wisdom till the time of difficulty. There's tons of knowledge out there right now. Articles, news feeds, blog posts, talking heads, Twitter feed, all types of information. There's all types of knowledge. Knowledge is raw information. We don't need more of that. Let me kind of differentiate here. Knowledge is when your head's spinning with all types of information. Wisdom is when you know and you're clear about what choices to make. Do you see it? Knowledge is when you got all types of information flowing, that scrolling screen, that talking head. Here's what the news broad said. Here's what the article I read said. Here's what this doc said. Here's what this person said. Here's what they said about the economy. Here's what Trump said. Here's what the Democrats said. Here's what she said. Here's what my neighbor said. Here's what the nurse said that I knew one time that's my second cousin, and here's what she said. And so we got all this stuff going, whoa, we're going crazy. That's called knowledge. That's not wisdom. You got a bunch of raw information in your head spinning. Can I say this to you? Let me tell you what wisdom is: when you have clarity about what decisions you're making. Knowledge is when you got a bunch of raw information. We are overwhelmed with raw information, and what we need is wisdom. Where does that come from? You know what James says? Ask God for it. It's what he wants to give you, and he wants to give it to you liberally. So let me use this in my own life, because I just want to speak to our church here. In our flesh, I think all of us want an explanation for this season we're in. Right now, in our flesh, I think we all want an explanation for the season that we're in. We want knowledge, information of why. So let me tell you something I've learned, because I've walked through the crucible a few times in life. And in my own life, when my mom died when I was a teenager, 17 years old, and then my dad died 2 years ago, both of them died of debilitating diseases. So what does that mean? We went through a season of suffering with both, and then we ultimately lost them to glory. So my life, much of, formed in my mother's death as a teenager for 2.5 years, watching her die of cancer. My father, the 5 years here as pastors, he kind of began to fade off in the suffering that was his physical sickness. I just want you to hear these next few statements I'm going to make. They're probably the most clear I can be. God did not give my parents those diseases because I needed to learn something. So somehow we think as Americans, my parents suffered, or I'm going through all this because I need to learn something. So God's given the world a global pandemic just so you can learn this one thing. But that's how narcissistic people think. It's an incredibly American selfish thinking. The world revolves around me. And so this is hard and this isn't good, and all this is hard and then all this is good because God's going to teach me this one thing. Stop. But let me tell you what I found in these seasons. In a broken and fallen world, diseases happen. And in those seasons, God was building something in me that would not have been there if I wouldn't have walked through it. But I didn't fully understand it till the backside of it. I just said a mouthful. I had to walk through a season of life as I watched my parents suffer. And God was forming something in me that I did not understand at the time, and that I only fully realized on the backside. Church, are you with me? My faith was more complete on the backside of it. I was a different person because I had to endure it than I would have been if I hadn't. If you're looking for an explanation for this season because that's what you think God owes you, you are missing what James is saying about trials and temptations, trials and tests. James says there's various kinds in this broken world, and we're all, when we face trials and tests, we're all going, what's this mean? What's this mean? What's this mean? Here's what I know for sure. Look at me and listen. If we are not different people on the backside of this, then we miss God in the midst of this. As clear as I can say. If we are not different people on the backside of this, then we missed God in the midst of this. And the most confounding thing James says that I skipped at the beginning, and I want to end right here as we get ready to worship together, is this. Count it all joy. Look right there. Underline in your Bible. Count it all joy. So before he talks about trials and tests and that it builds steadfastness in us, here it is. Count it all joy. Let me give you this most practical thing I can give you. Piece of advice I'm learning. As we're in 6 weeks of this, I think some of us need to re-up this in our mind, re-up this in our soul. Here's what James is saying. Outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines action. That'll preach. Outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines action. This is what I know. When we gather together, thousands of us on a Sunday, when we worship together, can I say this to you? Expectation determines experience. Here's what I know. When it comes to our worshiping together, if we expect great things from God, we'll experience great things from God. Expectation determines experience. So when we gather together, if we expect great things from God, we will experience great things with God. But if our expectation is low, you know what? Our experience will be low. And so when trials and tests come, here's what James is saying: count it all joy. What does that mean? Outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines action. He doesn't say consider yourself happy. Happy's emotion. He says count it all joy. Why? There's something in this God's building in you. There's something in this God's building inside of you that you may not know till the backside of it, but you've got to walk through it. Steadfast. Steadfast. Steadfast is not a 2-hour word. Steadfast is a 2-month word. Steadfast isn't a 2-hour word. Steadfast is a 2-month word. Outlook determines what are you building in me. Part of seeking wisdom, and here's where I want us to end, is asking God to change your perspective. You're 6 weeks in. The novelty of this whole thing is worn thin. I know it. You can ask my wife last night. I'd had it. I was tired, and I thought, man, as I laid in bed, what I knew was the novelty, the newness. It's just like this wears on our soul, the heaviness of it. And so here was my prayer. Lord, in the midst of all this heartache, in the midst of all this hurt, in the midst of all this unknown, in the midst of all this uncertainty, here's our prayer. Let me see it from your viewpoint. Outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines action. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. Say it with me. Outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines action. If we aren't different on the backside of this, then we miss God in this. Can I pray for you? I want you to grab a hand with somebody you're with, husband, wife. I just want to pray for you that God, you would help us 6 weeks into this shift perspective. I'm raising my hand as somebody who has felt the frustration and the wear and tear of the pause of life, the suspension of life, the uncertainty of what's next. And so I had to ask you laying in bed last night, Lord, you got to continue to change my perspective on this. I've got to see it from your viewpoint. So right now, husband and wife, that's what I want you to pray. That's called asking for wisdom. You don't need passion. You don't need energy. Let me tell you what you need in this season is wisdom. Wisdom's not an emotion. Wisdom's the ability to walk forward. So I want to say this over. Outcome. Listen to me. Outcome and action is what we're talking about. The reality. That my outlook determines my outcome, and my attitude determines my action in this season. Count it all joy. If I am not a different person on the backside of this, then I miss God in this. That's what my word to you is. Joel asked me the other day, Jason, what's God saying to you? Here's what God's saying to me. If Bethlehem Church isn't a different church on the backside of this, then we miss God in this. If I'm not a different person on the backside of this, then I miss God in this. Bethlehem Church staff, if you're not a different person on the backside of this, then you miss God in this. Bethlehem Church, if you're not a different person on the backside of this, then you miss God in this. And right now, some of you are missing God in this because you're letting your emotions rise up in you and you're in a funk. And this morning, here's what you need to say. My outlook determines my outcome. And my attitude determines my action. Steadfast is not a two-week word. Steadfast is a 2-month word. Steadfast is not a 2-hour word. We are learning to trade spoiled as a culture for steadfast.